Hey, good morning to you all. Welcome to another version of Weather Academy. I'm meteorologist Tom DeVecchio. Meteorologist Craig Flint is also here. And if tornadoes are the most violent of atmospheric phenomena, probably the one that has the most overall energy has to be the hurricane.
Yeah, I mean, the big difference here is just the sheer size of these two features. So we talked about tornadoes a couple of lessons because we talked about wind on Monday, a day that ends with Y.
Yes.
At this point.
One of those Y
One
days,
of those
yeah.
days. And we actually got some wind. You know, we gusted 50, 55.
I say 52, I think was the airport high.
52 was the highest gust, and we'll just quickly wanted to review that. So we were thinking leading up to it was going to be probably somewhere in that 50 to 60 degree range. It was a little lower because we didn't get as much sun. So the sun kind of adds turbulence to the air. Now still, 52 is no
52
slouch.
is no slouch, exactly, yes.
But if you were wondering why it didn't get as high, that's why. Because we weren't able to really tap into that wind up there and bring it down to the surface. So that's kind of been the common theme here. It's all about the sun. But pretty good forecast. I know there was, I was down in it firsthand down along the bayfront.
Yes,
so.
you were, yeah. Doing a live shot on the noon show and during the 5 o'clock shows
so it was
well.
definitely windy. So that kind of ties in what we're going to talk about today, because one of the big problems with hurricanes is wind, but not the biggest problem.
Correct.
So let's talk hurricanes. First of all, Tom, question for you. Can they happen here?
Can they happen here in Erie?
Yeah.
Hurricanes, no.
Right.
At least, no. Now we can get...
Not directly.
Right. I mean, we can get, remember, hurricanes are not only a tropical system, but we also have hurricane force winds, which we can get.
Right.
But we cannot get the classical hurricane.
Right. So basically, if there's a hurricane nearby, we would feel the effects of it, but we wouldn't actually see like a landfalling hurricane. We'd probably see some form of remnants.
Off of Lake Erie, yeah. Hurricane isn't going to form on Lake Erie,
Right.
Great Lakes, or, and move into our region.
So overall, hurricanes, much larger storm systems, okay? And when you compare the two, hurricane versus tornado, the damage is usually pretty localized.
Sure.
Okay? With hurricanes, the damage can be hundreds of miles. And that picture right there is a picture of Hurricane Isabel.
Oh, yes.
That moved up along the East Coast. And look at how wide that storm is.
It covers several states. I mean, it's not just, tornadoes. Large tornadoes are maybe a mile wide. Hurricanes are hundreds of miles across. 5 sometimes. I mean, this one here, looks at least 5, even 600 miles from outer band to outer band. Now, again, to give you a little bit of sense of, Pennsylvania is 325 miles wide.
Okay.
From the border, from the Ohio border to the New Jersey border. So almost two Pennsylvanias wide is how big these hurricanes can get.
Yeah, and the thing is these are they are clusters of thunderstorms that form over the tropics around a central circulation, and they just continue to grow. You want to talk about energy. These things have a lot of energy. And we're going to kind of break this down and show you how all this happens here. So some pretty cool graphics that we've come up with. And we'll start with this one. So here's the initial setup. Hurricanes feed off of warm ocean water. So that's what that 80 degrees Fahrenheit represents, that warm ocean water. And there can't be a lot of upper level wind as you go up higher in the atmosphere. And the atmosphere has to be moist, and over the ocean, it definitely is. So that starts the air rising.
And then as the temperatures go up, and again, you know, he has her 80. That's an average temperature.
Right.
Sometimes the ocean temperature can get 85, occasionally 90, almost bath water. And like Craig said, that's a lot of heat. So you see that when air gets warmer and more moist, it makes the air less dense, and it starts to rise into a column. And you can see there at the top of the screen, that column can turn into what we often call the wall, the eye wall of the hurricane.
Eye wall. So you've got your air rising, which this process is kind of like a positive feedback loop, what we call that, with the air rushing in around a center of circulation. So that continuous rising motion keeps thunderstorms forming. So it just keeps going, all right? You got that warm ocean water, which causes the air to rise, and eventually you get a circulation to form because of Coriolis force and, you know, pressure gradient force,
There you
all
go.
that stuff
Sure.
that we look at, which causes these thunderstorms to form. And then eventually you start to get the rotation, which makes it a tropical system.
Absolutely, and the rotation causes spin up, which allows, as Craig said, the positive feedback means that as the circulation grows and continues to spin, it brings in more moisture, which feeds into the system, and that's why the system can continue to grow. Now, eventually it reaches a point where it can't grow anymore. One of the things that Craig had said is you don't want a lot of upper level wind. And because hurricanes, in order for a hurricane to really sustain itself, the column needs to be vertical. You don't want it tilted. Odd enough, when you have severe storms, you want the tilt. But with hurricanes, you want to have a nice straight column of spin from the bottom of the hurricane all the way to the top.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if it starts to tilt, if the winds get too strong in the upper atmosphere, it tilts it, and it becomes much less efficient, and that usually is what causes a hurricane to dissipate.
Yeah, it kind of tears it apart. So let's take a look at this in a different dimension. So we start with what we call a tropical depression. We talked about the warm ocean water. We talked about the air rushing into the center of a circulation and these clusters of thunderstorms that form. So that's kind of what that animation is showing you right there. The storms build around a central surface location, and tropical depressions, it's just that. It's just a strong area of low pressure. You know, not a lot of damage associated with tropical depressions. Winds 39 miles per hour, which classifies it as a tropical depression, and with some sort of low-level circulation.
Right.
That's what defines it as a tropical depression. So that's like the lowest rung of the ladder here. So you start off with what we call a tropical depression. At this point, they are not named, and we're going to go into names here shortly, but they are not named. It's just an area of low pressure, cluster of thunderstorms with a closed circulation that will likely, or in some cases won't, develop into something further. So, tropical depression there. Next
level up is
the tropical
storm. And again, as we said, you know, if the positive feedback continues, the tropical depression turns into a tropical storm. Once the wind speeds sustained, in other words, constant wind speeds go over 40 miles an hour, then we get into what we call it a tropical storm. And you can see it goes from 39 to 73 miles an hour. So the air is intensifying, the circulation is going, and it continues to build. In this particular graphic, there is no eye yet.
Right.
Sometimes you might get one, oftentimes you don't. But at this point, now when it becomes tropical storm, now we do give it a name.
Yep.
And that's when the name begins, when you get into that tropical storm phase.
So next up, obviously, is when it grows and matures into a hurricane. Very strong rising air near the center, and with hurricanes, you tend to get an eye, a central pressure that's lower than the surrounding air pressure, which is what forms the eye. This is when they become dangerous in terms of wind, okay? Tropical storms can be dangerous in their own respect with flooding and gusty wind, but Now we're talking winds sustained over 74, 75 miles an hour. Again, sustained meaning constant. And these hurricanes are graded, if you will, on a category of 1 to 5. It's called the Saffir-Simpson scale. 1 being the weakest, 5 being the strongest. But don't get hung up on that terminology, because a Category 1 hurricane can still be very powerful. Then we get into the major hurricane stage.
Right, and as Craig said, they go through the Saffir-Simpson scale has 5 levels. Once a hurricane reaches a Category 3, where the wind speeds are above 115 miles an hour, it is considered a, quote, major hurricane. And like Craig said, all hurricanes are dangerous, but this is when the winds really become destructive. Most homes can survive wind gusts to 100, 110. Now, the roofs may come off and you'll get damaged, but usually they can stay up. Once you get to a major hurricane, even well-constructed homes can be blown over. And that's why they get that classification as major. So still heavy amounts of rain, and now the damage, which can be widespread with a small hurricane, becomes what we call catastrophic, where cities can be leveled and you get a very large damage. And there you can see a very well-defined eye, usually with a major hurricane.
And those eye walls in a hurricane, or the eye of a hurricane, I should say, are pretty cool to look at, because if you have a very well-defined eye in the center of a storm, you can actually see different characteristics and actually little vortices that spin around within the eye. So when you see the eye of a hurricane, that storm's nothing to mess with. Now you might be wondering, well, thunderstorms, we told you to get inside. Tornadoes, you go to the basement.
Right.
With hurricanes, what do? Get out of the way.
Leave.
Yeah, because they're so big. So that's why when we get into hurricane season, especially along the coast, and there's a hurricane coming towards the United States, they issue evacuation orders.
Right.
Because there's really no safe place to be. And the other facet of a hurricane is not only the very powerful and destructive wind, but flooding. Depending on the speed of the storm and also the amount of water it throws up onto the land can be pretty catastrophic in and of itself. So not only do you have wind, but you have flooding issues. And sometimes, we've talked a little bit about friction. So when they're out over the open water, there's nothing to slow them down until they run into the land. And then when they run into the land, they encounter that friction, which can slow the storm down.
Right.
And that is when you get these just catastrophic rainfall amounts, because these storms literally will sit there or move very slowly until they can't rain anymore. So they just rain themselves out, which causes issues.
Exactly. Those summertime thunderstorms, they rain out and they last about an hour. But, a hurricane, which can give anywhere 10, 15, 20 inches. Was it 2 years ago? Houston had 50.
Yeah.
I believe
Charlie?
it was 2.
Was it Charlie?
Was it Charlie? Yeah, one of the ones.
I think it was Charlie.
Louisiana and Texas. I mean, think of that, 50 inches of rain. That's about 500 inches of snow, and we're not kidding here.
Right.
And Craig was talking about, the surge. We call it the storm surge. On the right-hand side of a hurricane, that's the areas where it brings water it brings the water up on the land. So it's the right side of those hurricanes, or what we call the eastern quadrant, the northeast quadrant especially. That's the part of the hurricane. That would be the area right here.
So if you looked at that hurricane and you put like a target on it, like if you drew a cross on it, okay, that right front part of the storm. Let me see if I can do this. That right front
there
part,
we go.
right there.
Yeah, right there.
Between my hands, that's the worst part of the storm right there. Because think about it, you got the counterclockwise circulation like this, okay, and it's moving like this. So that part of the storm is taking all that ocean water, throwing it up on the land. okay? And so that right front quadrant, right in there, that's the worst place to be in a hurricane. There's really no good place to be. Let me just make that clear. You want to get out of the way.
Absolutely.
When there's a hurricane coming.
Now, the good news in all this is say, oh my gosh, what do you do? Now, the good news, our hurricane forecasting has vastly improved, even since Hurricane Katrina, which is probably the grandfather, probably the one that really got us into the modern, modern age of, because it made so much news. I mean, we're pretty good. We can give as much as, 3 days notice now is commonplace.
Right.
And that gives you plenty of time to, to move out. And sometimes if you have a city of several million, trying to move people out, even under the best of circumstances, can cause traffic jams. So that's why, when people in hurricane areas, we are fortunate we don't have to worry too much about that around here. But along the coast, you can really get some.
And that's one good thing about hurricane forecasting, where again, comparing it to thunderstorms and tornadoes, we can look and say, hey, look, there's a chance for severe thunderstorms, but it's pretty much almost impossible to predict where a tornado is going to drop.
Right.
Hurricanes, we know. We know several days in advance the areas that are kind of in line. There's plenty of lead time with hurricanes. So let's talk about hurricane names, okay? We get asked this question a lot, and basically they alternate names. So you can see for this year, we start with a male name, Arthur. That means next year we will start with a female
name. Right.
Okay? And that's how they base the names. So we kind of go guy, girl, guy, girl, guy, girl, guy, girl. That is a list of the 2020 hurricane names. Starts with Arthur and ends with Wilfred. So check that out. Maybe your name's on there.
Perhaps so. You'll also notice, besides going girl, guy, you'll also notice that we have English, Spanish, and even some French in there, because the Western and this is the Western Hemisphere. Typhoons, which are hurricanes that form hurricanes are strictly speaking Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico. Typhoons are hurricanes that form the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. They get their own names. And how hurricanes are named is kind of an interesting story. Way back before 1955, they gave hurricanes numbers. Storm 1, Storm 2. And what they found, ships, captains were getting confused as to, okay, which one was number 1, which one was number 2. To make a long story short, it was found that people are better remembering alphabetical names as opposed to remembering numbers. So in the 1950s, they started with naming the hurricanes. It was originally all girls, all English names. I'm not sure why they just picked female names. Maybe because ships have female names. Maybe it was the hurricane. And then in 1979, the guys say, hey, what about us? We can be furious, so ferocious. So they started in 1979 going girl, guy, girl, guy. And then I believe in the late 80s, they started to add more of the Spanish name because we have a high amount of Spanish-speaking and French-speaking people here in the Western Hemisphere.
And just a couple other quick notes before we go. You might be asking yourself, well, what if you get through the entire alphabet? What if you get all the way
Very good
through?
question. And that's happened.
That has happened recently.
It did.
So
yeah.
That has happened. The thing is sometimes you get these tropical storms that form way out there in the middle of nowhere, fish storms I call them, because they don't really affect anything but the fish. So, for example, let's just say we get a tropical storm, Bertha, that's way out in the Atlantic Ocean that nobody ever hears anything about, and then Cristobal comes slamming into Florida. People will go, well, what about B? So sometimes these hurricanes, they'll form and they won't hit anything, but they still get checked off the list in terms of the names. So you got to pay attention to that. But when we get through the alphabet, we actually go to the Greek alphabet. So if we get all the way through Wilfred, because there's no X, Y, or Z names
Correct.
this year, we will switch to the Greek alphabet, alpha, beta, gamma, so on and so forth, which has happened before.
It has.
Yeah.
It has. And not too long ago. You're right. I don't recall. I want to say 2011, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, we had to go through and again, only maybe 10 to 20% of hurricanes actually hit land. The others, like you said, they're out in the ocean. Some last for maybe 12 hours. They hit because remember, they get named a tropical storm status, and then boom, off they go.
Yeah.
And that happens a lot.
Yeah. So we don't really have to deal with it too much here, but just thought it would be interesting to kind of cover that for you.
Absolutely.
Because we are going into the tropics, and
June 1st
yeah,
is the beginning of,
is the beginning
hurricane season. Before you know it, it'll be here.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens as we head through the Atlantic hurricane season. So anyway, remember, we're always asking, find your inspiration. What inspires you? And if you have any weather questions, we want to hear from you, weather at WJETTV.com.
And we're getting a lot of requests on things to talk about, but we always could use more because we have, we still have all of May and at least the first week of June before school officially lets out for the summertime. So yeah, always like to know what your topics are, and what you want to talk about.
All right.
Okay.
Coming up Friday, we do have kind of a fun little topic to talk about.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to talk about sky optics.
Yeah.
What is that? You'll find out Friday.
That's right. Until then, thank you so much for joining us on our What Inspires You at the Weather Academy. I'm meteorologist Tom DeVecchio for Craig Flint. Take care, and we will see you Friday.
See ya.